Good morning and welcome to the Full Scottish on this Sunday, the 29th of September. The Full Scottish is Broadcasting Scotland's review of the headlines of the past week. And I'm Douglas MacKenzie, and I'm pleased to welcome two guests to discuss the stories behind the headlines with us today. In this week, which marks the 25th anniversary of the reconvening of the Scottish Parliament, I'm joined by one of the first intake from 1999. Linda Fabiani was MSP for Central Scotland from 1999 to 2011, and then until 2021, the MSP for East Kilbride. During that time, she served on many committees and was also the Minister for Europe and the Deputy Presiding Officer. Welcome, Linda.
Hi.
My second guest this morning, well-known face on the programme, the renowned economist Frances Coppola. She's well known for her book, The Case for People's Quantitative Easing, and which came out in 2019, and coming out soon, The Absolute Essentials of Banking, which sounds like something we all need. And there will be a lot of economics to get your teeth into this morning, I suspect. Welcome,
Yes.
Frances.
Hi, everyone.
As with all our news programmes, we begin with an update from Ukraine on this day 949 since the full-scale invasion of the country by Russia. At least 10 people were killed in two consecutive Russian attacks on a hospital in Sumy. Initial shelling had killed one and damaged several floors of the building, but Russian forces struck again during the evacuation of the hospital's patients, authorities said. At least 22 were reported injured in the attacks. Danielle Bell, head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, said loitering munitions, or suicide drones, hit the St. Panteleimon Clinical Hospital in two attacks 45 minutes apart. Most of the fatalities occurred during the second strike, which hit as first responders arrived at the site and patients attempted to evacuate, she said. Sumy city is located 32 kilometers from the Russian border. President Zelensky condemned the Sumy attack. Everyone in the world who speaks about this war must pay attention to what Russia is targeting, Zelensky wrote on X. They are waging war on hospitals, civilian objects, and people's lives. Only strength can force Russia into peace. Peace through strength is the only right way. Russia's top diplomat Sergei Lavrov has warned against trying to fight to victory with a nuclear power, delivering a UN General Assembly speech packed with condemnations of what Russia sees as Western machinations in Ukraine and elsewhere, including inside the United Nations itself. China's foreign minister has warned against an expansion of the battlefield in the war in Ukraine and said the Beijing government remained committed to shuttle diplomacy and efforts to push the conflict towards its end. China, along with Brazil, has proposed new talks involving Kyiv and Moscow, and this week gathered global South countries behind that plan. Zelensky dismissed China and Brazil's efforts, questioning why they were proposing an alternative to his own peace formula. In an interview with Fox News aired on Saturday, President Volodymyr Zelensky said he had received very direct information from Donald Trump that the ex-president would support Ukraine in the war against Russia if he is re-elected in the November presidential election. Two Russian attacks in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region killed 4 people on Saturday, including a Supreme Court judge who was delivering aid to local residents in a civilian car. Russia is prepared to go to court over the Nord Stream pipeline explosions, with a foreign ministry spokesman saying that Russia has filed pre-trial claims against Denmark, Germany, Sweden and Switzerland. NATO members Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland will seek EU funding to build a network of bunkers, barriers, distribution lines and military warehouses along their borders with Russia and Belarus, Estonia's officials have said. The 3 Baltic countries initially announced the plan for a Baltic defence line in January. North Korea, which has been accused of illegally supplying weapons to Russia, has said that US military aid worth $8 billion to Ukraine was, quote, an incredible mistake and playing with fire against nuclear superpower Russia. Vladimir Putin has warned he could use nuclear weapons if Russia were to be hit with missiles. North Korea has shipped at least 16,500 containers of weapons to Russia since September last year, and Russia has fired missiles from those Korean shipments against Ukraine. Well, President Zelensky was in the United States this week, and according to the media, did not get approval for long-range strikes from Ukraine into Russia. He, however, said that the media reporting did not accurately reflect the discussions that he'd had, and the first people who would know if permission had been given would be the Russians. Be that as it may, the double tap strike on a hospital in Sumy and the 9 or 10 glide bombs which were fired against civilian targets in Zaporizhia yesterday, it seems that there are red lines for Ukraine and no red lines applied against Russia. Would that be your view as well, Linda?
Yes, generally. However, you then get on to the question of, so what do you do about that? I certainly don't feel qualified enough to be able to give a sensible view as to what should happen now. I mean, my feelings come from the heart rather than the head, and I'm more than willing to admit that. There's a bit of you thinks that yes, Ukraine should be given everything it needs and quite a gung-ho approach from Western allies. I get that. But then, of course, you have to think of the bigger picture, what would happen in that regard. I've read various commentators, some who think that with Russia it's all a big bluff. It's a heck of a chance to be taking. And then when you look at their allies, I mean, North Korea, could you ever trust anything with North Korea? And talking of trust, I mean, I thought it was interesting what Donald Trump has said to President Zelensky. I certainly wouldn't put any faith or trust in anything he says. The China and Brazil peace talks, interested in hearing more about that. But the thing is, of course, all these peace talks seem to hint towards Ukraine giving up some of its sovereign territory. And in the middle of all that, there are people. So I'm just not seeing a way forward out of this at all at the moment that you could possibly term as a clear path. Sorry, depressing.
Well, indeed. Francis, to pick up on what Linda was saying there about this nuclear saber rattling of the Russians, which has been picked up by their partners as well. The recent US Department of Justice indictments of several people involved in running the massive Russian influence operations listed the Russians' number one goal was to create what they called nuclear psychosis, fear that Russia would use nuclear weapons. They seem to have been fairly successful in doing that, given the hedging comments from many.
Yeah, they do. And what can you do? Russia is a nuclear power, and so is North Korea, which is backing it, and possibly Iran too, for all we know. So the risk that there would be a nuclear strike is actually quite substantial. If Western powers agreed to allow Ukraine to use their weapons supplied by them to strike deep into Russia, then NATO arguably is then joining the war, and that is the problem. And that raises the risk of escalation into nuclear territory and what have you. I am unconvinced by any of the peace talks, because I think that Russia's objective here is actually to eliminate Ukraine. They've said that all along. Actually, what they say for Western consumption and what they say domestically are two different things, and it's what they say for domestic consumption you need to listen to. We'll encounter the same situation again shortly when we talk about Israel. It's what they say to their domestic audience that you need to pay attention to, and the rhetoric to the domestic audience in Russia has always been about eliminating Ukraine. I see no reason to suppose that peace talks would lead to anything but a lot of stalling tactics and diversions, because in the end, that's what Russia wants, is all of Ukraine, or dismembering it and handing over the bits it doesn't want to Poland and Hungary.
Yes, sadly, I'm sure you're right on that. And you mentioned Israel, and we turn to that next. At least 41,586 Palestinians have been killed and 96,210 wounded in Gaza since 7th of October. And more than 1,000 have been killed and 6,000 wounded in Lebanon in the past week. The Israeli bombardment has also displaced 98,800 people, according to the Lebanese government. Well, the Benjamin Netanyahu held up a map, supposedly of Israel, showing it covering the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and parts of southern Lebanon. After the 1967 war, an extreme party was founded in Israel called the Eretz Yisrael Party, which looked to create this body called Greater Israel, which commentators at the time likened to Hitler's plan for Gross Deutschland. Now, the party was disbanded in 1976 and subsumed into Likud, but it seems that its agenda from then is now mainstream Israeli politics with Netanyahu. I'll start with you, Francis, because I saw you were tweeting this morning about the background to the conflict after the end of the British mandate for Palestine. So perhaps you'd like to pick up on that.
Well, I've been doing a little bit of background research on this because people are saying this is really complex, and when you listen to the two different sides, you get two very different stories. So I was looking to see what evidence there is. One of the things that I've often seen said, and that has been used by Israel and Israeli supporters, including Judge Sobatindi at the International Court of Justice, to base a claim claim to the whole of the land between the sea and the river, so including the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, based upon the idea that after the end of the expiry of the British Mandate in May 1948, the only state to emerge, and therefore the continuing state, was Israel, and that the Arabs never declared a state themselves. And I've seen that said a number of times. And so I checked it out, and it turns out that it is not true. That in fact the Arabs had in fact put forward a proposal to the United Nations at the time that the partition plan was produced, rejecting the partition plan and offering as an alternative a single multi-ethnic, multi-faith democratic state, based upon the principles that actually the British Mandate itself had proposed in 1939. So, and then the day after the British Mandate expired, on the 15th of May 1948, the League of Arab States sent a cable to the United Nations Secretary General declaring the establishment of this multi-ethnic, multi-faith, single democratic state, exercising the right to self-determination of all Palestinian, of all the people living in what had been the British Mandate of Palestine. A few hours before that, Israel had declared independence. So we can have an argument as to whether the Jewish state seceded from the continuing Palestinian state, or whether the Palestinian state seceded from the Jewish state. We can have an argument about that. But to say that no state was ever declared is actually untrue. The problem is that although the Arab states went to war with Israel to establish it, both sides tried to lay claim to all the land rather than negotiating a split, a partition which, as the Jewish minority wanted their own state, which is their right, was always going to be inevitable. Both sides went to war to try and squash the other, and the Arab states lost, and then they lost interest in Palestinian self-determination and carved up the remains of Palestine between them. And that's kind of the tragedy of Palestine. And it took until 1988 before Palestinians could actually say, actually, we want our own state and we're declaring it now. And even now, it's not fully recognised by the whole of the world. But we are seeing movements towards that now.
Thank you. Linda has gone black on her screen.
Yes.
Okay, so staying with you then, Francis. I mean, we've discussed many times in depressing terms what is happening in Gaza and the need for a ceasefire and to stop that. And now things have moved on, and it's the West Bank, it's Lebanon, and Stephen Flynn, the SNP Westminster leader, was talking today for full diplomatic pressure. Yet Israel seems, or Netanyahu seems to be pretty resistant to any kind of pressure. Is there a way forward?
Well, the obvious way forward would be for Western companies to stop supplying Israel with arms, while Israel, and particularly the United States, continues to arm Israel, to essentially approve everything it does, to refrain from putting sanctions on anybody in power. Israel will continue to do what Israel does, and that at the moment includes flattening Gaza, ethnically cleansing the West Bank, and terrorizing the people of Lebanon.
Do you think this is a deeply held belief by Joe Biden, or is it simply that he's terrified of alienating the Jewish lobby before the election, and that there will be a change with Kamala Harris if she comes to the presidency?
If you actually look at American politics, it's very evident that a lot of politicians rely on funding from the Israeli lobby. So it's difficult to see that much would change under Kamala Harris' presidency. That said, Joe Biden historically has been a very committed Zionist. So he has been more lenient with the Israeli government, with Netanyahu, than previous presidents such as Reagan and the first Bush, people like that, who actually were prepared to stand up to the Israeli prime ministers at the time. Reagan famously, in the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, rang Menachem Begin and said, "You've got to stop this, this is a Holocaust." And Begin apparently said to him, "I know what a Holocaust is, thank you very much." And Reagan said, "And that's what you're doing, so stop it." And he did. But then they were prepared to follow through and say, "You have to stop or we will stop supporting you. We will impose an arms embargo." And they did. I mean, interestingly, to her credit, Margaret Thatcher imposed an arms embargo on Israel. Our present leaders from either side have shown no willingness to do any such thing. So right now, Israel seems to be getting much more of a free pass for its behaviour than previous Western politicians would have allowed. And I think that is, in a way, why it has escalated so much, and why I think we are a long way from the end of this.
Yeah, you mentioned the funding which goes to American politicians from the state of Israel, but it seems to be the same with the Labour Party in this country, with the Labour Friends of Israel, and it's not going to make a huge difference to the Israeli Defence Force if Britain did stop supplying arms, but at least it would be a token, would it not, to show willingness?
It would be a gesture. It would send an important signal, and indeed it did. I mean, to be fair, the government did impose a very limited arms embargo, and there were absolute shrieks from the Israeli government about it. We expect our allies to stand by us, and that was a tiny little gesture, but they hated it. So I think there's scope there for a bit more pressure on we are not going to supply you, we are not going to support you, we're going to impose some more sanctions, things like that, without possibly going quite as far as a full arms embargo.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to tax and the suggestion that Rachel Reeves is planning to roll back on Labour's commitment to tax avoiding UK residents, the non-DOMs, while doubling down on plans to force the long-term sick into work, and of course the means testing of pensioners' winter fuel allowance.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose there are two separate arguments here which don't necessarily mesh. The first one is the economic one, where Jeremy Hunt kind of shot Rachel Reeves's fox by imposing various restrictions in his last budget, claiming that they would raise £2.7 billion. She then had to go further in the election and say, well, we'll squeeze another 1 billion out of it. And of course, during an election, any tax on the people is always going to be the most popular. So, good. I'm glad Linda is back. But I'll turn to you first, Francis, with the Treasury saying, well, actually, this is not going to raise any money at all. In fact, it's going to lose money by driving people away. So, do the economics, and I'll turn to Linda for the politics. Do the economics make sense by abandoning the idea to tax non-doms further?
I always felt that there was a good moral reason for taxing non-doms, but not really an economic case. We do see quite a few things like this where there's a good moral reason, that there's reasons for taxing things to change behaviour. But you shouldn't really count on it raising any money, because if people actually alter their behaviour in the way that you want, you aren't going to raise any money. Or even if people adjust their behaviour in the way that you don't want, like, non-dom saying, in that case, we won't live here. So I think that you should always be aware of the unforeseen consequences of tax decisions, what we call the tax incidence. Who actually pays this? And to my mind, neither the Tories nor, sadly, the Labour Party, certainly before the last election, were paying a great deal of attention to that. There was a lot of kind of political snowballising and not a great deal of attention to the real economic benefits and and who actually would end up paying for the tax proposals they were making. And so that those chickens are beginning to come home to roost a bit. I would like to think that in the budget there will be more of a commitment to looking seriously at how we can get the rich to pay more tax. But in a way, cherry-picking a non-dom proposal, which had been partly hijacked by the Tories anyway, is perhaps needed to put that to one side and say, well, actually, we're going to have some water between us and the Conservatives on this, and we'll come up with our own proposals in due course. Because that was the other thing, was they were getting accused of basically taking on board a Tory policy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, welcome back, Linda. So Francis there spoke about the moral argument, and you would say that after scrapping the winter fuel allowance and not revoking the 2-child cap, talking about forcing the long-term sick back into work, abandoning plans for non-doms taxation at the same time as a £4 million donation from a Cayman Islands fund to the Labour Party, the charitable might say is an unfortunate political coincidence. So that piled on top of the suits and the sponsorship, has the People's Party completely lost touch with the people?
Yeah.
Okay, I
think it's become a bit of a stock phrase. We've heard people saying over the last few years, I didn't leave the Labour Party, the Labour Party left me. It's become a bit of a cliche, but actually I think it's reality. Certainly the Labour Party that you look at now, certainly at UK level, unfortunately Scotland, what's called Scottish Labour, seems to be buying into it at the moment. It's just not what anybody would have thought was the party of the working person, the party of the workers. And I thought it was really interesting. I only just came in as Francis started to speak there on this issue. The first thing I heard Francis say was about non-dom stuff, was the moral reasons for taxing non-doms. And it seems to me that this is what Labour have shrugged off, is the moral issues. Seems to be all about getting and maintaining power. So the moral issue of taxing the rich, the moral issue of universality in some so-called benefits, which, by the way, most people have contributed to along the way, and most people recognise that there are always those who can't contribute for very, very good reasons. So I think the morality of the Labour Party is what is sadly lacking in all of this. And it's the rhetoric that's used as well that really upsets me. You know, we hear talk about scroungers, for example, when it comes to welfare, but we hear talk of tax avoiders when it comes to the rich people. So yeah, the morality is missing. The other thing that Francis said I totally buy into is that they should be looking at how to tax wealth, because we don't really tax wealth in the UK. We tax earnings and various other things, but we don't really tax wealth. If we were serious about taxing wealth, we'd be looking at land tax, for example, and various other methods, and really tackling avoidance of tax, and not just concentrating on the piddling little amount in comparison that are people claiming too much from the welfare system for whatever reasons, not always their own fault.
Yeah, it seems strange. The Labour Party had 14 years to practice getting into government. They must have gone through so many focus groups and plans of what they were going to do and how they were going to present it. But it seems, in terms of public relations, at the very least, they've made a complete hash of it. Linda, as a politician, I mean, you've been through many campaigns and governments. It must be awful. And not that I'm sympathising with Labour
Yeah,
MPs, but to go and have to defend that to your constituents.
Aye, every party makes a hash of something at some time or another. My own party is certainly not immune to that, particularly over the last few years. And it is very, very difficult, as a politician, to go out and defend some stuff. It's a question you're asked a lot when you're a serving politician, what's your red lines? And I was very, very clear about mine, which were mainly issues of racism, issues of inequality, that kind of thing was always my big thing. Everybody getting a fair crack of the whip and a fair shout in life. And my red line would have been, to use an example, for example, if my party had started saying horrendous things about asylum seekers and immigration, all the things that Labour are saying now, my goodness, that would have been my red line, and I'd have gone. I only ever broke the whip once, by the way, in 22 years, but I consider myself very fortunate in that my party was generally going along with my own beliefs. I've thought quite a lot about if I were in the current Labour Party. Oh my goodness, I don't know how they do it. And I look at the likes of Richard Leonard in the Scottish Parliament, Monica Lennon's another one in the Scottish Parliament, who have been quite clear that they're uncomfortable with a lot of the direction of travel of UK Labour and the fact that Scott Lab are going along with it. I read this morning that Rosie Duffield had resigned from the party. So yeah, it's hard when something that has been your core belief system changes so much that you just don't feel part of it anymore. So I do have a certain sympathy for what are called the rebels, but actually in this case the rebels seem to be the ones that are holding true to the principles of what was a very proud Labour Party.
Francis, looking from a little outside politics, as Linda said, Rosie Duffield resigned last night. There are also several MPs where the whip has been taken away from them. Do you see an implosion coming with those who see this as a betrayal of Labour values, and will there be more resignations? There was talk last week or the week before, I can't remember, of Jeremy Corbyn talking about a new party.
It's possible. Arguably we need a party that's further to the left, because the Labour Party is no longer left. It's very centrist. It's further left than the Tories, but that's not saying much. So if Jeremy Corbyn created a new left party, I think there is space for that in Britain right now. I do think there could be more resignations. more people resigning the Labour whip, and more people having the whip removed from them. And given the size of Starmer's majority, he can afford to take that. And I think that's what people are missing. The huge majority like that, even quite a major fight in the parliamentary Labour Party would not bring down his government. So, in a way, there is permission to rebels to rebel.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was pretty sure that a large majority would mean that it would be interesting times in the Labour Party and they would create their own opposition. So, looking at the other force in UK politics, the Conservative conference opens in Birmingham this week. The Scottish branch of the party has a new leader, Russell Finlay, and by the end of the conference in Birmingham, the 4 UK leadership contenders, Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, Tom Tugendhat, and James Cleverly, will be reduced to 2. So you might want to talk, first of all, Linda, about the Scottish Conservatives and Russell Finlay, but keen then for a runners and riders guide to the candidates for the UK election, who you think will win and what issues they will win on.
Well, I tell you what, I have long given up even thinking that I could make any kind of realistic projections about what will happen to the Tory party, because over the last few years they've just gone from something that you could look at and recognise, didn't like, but recognise, to something that you're like, what has happened here? They just seem to get worse and worse and worse. So there's none of the 4 for the UK level that I look at and think, oh, they must be a front runner. And I'm on as well, just not interested enough, I have to say, to really look at it closely. When it comes to the Scottish Parliament, I don't know Russell Finlay. He only got elected in 21 after I retired, so I have never come across him. What I would say is that the Tory party in the Scottish Parliament was a very different beast from 2016 on under, what's his name? I'm managing to forget quickly. Douglas Ross. Douglas Ross was a very different kind of leader from the ones who had gone before. He was nasty. He was cock of the walk, arrogant. He was everything that I don't like in people, never mind in politicians. And there was an uncomfortableness with some of the folks sitting in these benches in that period, 2016 to 21, which I was able to observe very well, sitting in the presiding officer's chair every day. And so they were a very different beast from the Annabel Goldies, even the Jackson Carlaws, the ones that had gone before. And I understand from colleagues who are still in Holyrood that the Tory group of 21 onwards was even more so. So if their new leader in Scotland is of the same type that we have seen building over the last few years, that doesn't bode well. Having said that, I think the Tories in Scotland have become more of an irrelevance through Douglas Ross and some of the others and their behaviour, not to mention the behaviour of the Tories at Westminster over the last few years under the successive awful leadership. So, I think the main battles now for Scotland are between Labour and the SNP. And to go back to what Francis and you were talking about in the last item, where are the main battles south of the border at UK level? Hopefully not reform. But I often feel for England that it's quite a shame that there isn't a really good alternative that people can go to away from the established UK parties at the moment. So I think I've rambled on long enough on that, Douglas, and I forget what the initial question was.
Who's going to win? But as a brilliant politician, you
I have no idea.
Giving an answer on that. So I'll see if an economist will put our money where our mouth is, and see if Francis can talk about the leadership candidates at a national level for the Conservatives.
Well, the two front runners appear to be Badenoch and Jenrick, which is just of a piece with the Tory party, because both of them have a history of sleaze, and in Badenoch's case, actual criminal behaviour. Hacking a website is criminal. So the principles, both of them are questionable. So I'm not sure that either of them is an improvement. Maybe Tugendhat is a bit more, has a bit more in the way of principles, and Cleverly, I just think it's a bit of a non-entity, really. Never was a man worse named. So I could be wrong about this, is that it will come down to a fight between Jenrick and Badenoch. And the fight will be, and already is, on who can be nastier to immigrants. It is absolutely about that. That is all it is about. Yeah, absolutely. How can I be nasty to immigrants? Her Islamophobia thing about we shouldn't be letting people in who hate Israel, who come from countries which regard Israel as an enemy. So that would mean right now she would be saying no to Lebanese refugees, even people who've had nothing to do with Hezbollah, which is more than half of the Lebanese population, actually. She'd be saying no, Lebanon regards Israel as an enemy, so they can't come. It is just plain racism and Islamophobia. I say Islamophobia, but more than half the Lebanese population are actually Christians, and presumably she banned them too. We forget that. So it's just we hate Arabs. Well, that's racism, isn't it? So it looks to me both of them are going down this. We have to have this kind of fortress Britain, xenophobic, racist, frankly fascist agenda, and they're just fighting out as to who could be worse. The Tory party would probably go for the worst one, because I think that's where we are. They're not the Tory party of that my parents were members of. They are the English National Party, and that's actually what we should be calling them. The English Nationalist Party is actually what we should be calling
them. Do you think, being nasty to immigrants, do you think there'll be a be nasty to Europe competition as well in terms of Brexit? Yes, you're nodding, Linda. You wanted to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there already. One of the things that's going to happen next year, of course, is that there's going to be a visa system of sorts for people travelling from the UK to countries in the European Union. Now, the UK, Britain, has a huge tradition of everything that was good that came from Europe, claiming it as something the UK government did as far as they possibly could, and a tradition of everything that was perhaps a wee bit difficult, blaming it on the European Union, whether it was their fault or not. Now, post-Brexit, I think that carries on. Therefore, when everybody starts getting up in arms at having to pay these electronic visa things, going on holiday next year, when other things kick in, the right-wing press in the UK and politicians in the UK will all say, oh, it's all Europe's fault. Look at these nasty European Union people and what they're doing to us. They won't come up front and say, it's because of Brexit. It's because we didn't negotiate a proper deal in leaving. It's because we turned down the potential of not having to do that, because we didn't want all these nasty foreigners coming into our shores and having rights. I think that's what will happen. I think it's happening already in terms of, I've actually had people say to me, my nephew, whatever, isn't able to go and study in France for his year out. I mean, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. How dare they? How dare who? And there's this propensity to blame the foreigner, and it's all part of the nasty rhetoric that's been going on in the UK for decades now.
Yeah, that's a good point on education there, and interesting that this week Keir Starmer again, or 2 weeks ago, refused to rejoin the
Hmm.
Erasmus scheme for exchanges.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, accepted a flat worth between 20,000 and 100,000, so that his son could study. So it's a challenge for the Tory candidates to be nastier about Europe than the current Labour government, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yeah, and you look at the four candidates for the Tory leadership, Francis, and you couldn't, by any stretch of the imagination, say that there were big beasts in politics the way that we've had in the past, in former uh, challenges for leadership of the Tory party. So that weakness surely leaves the spectre of Nigel Farage in the wings, does it not?
Very much so. And
Well, do you
Farage
know,
is very much,
we both jumped in, sorry.
yeah, sorry,
Okay,
You
well,
carry
we'll
on,
start with Francis.
yeah, very much so. And he's very much positioning himself that way, and his party is positioning itself that way. Farage is doing in the UK Parliament what he did in the European Parliament, which is not to do his job, but to spend a great deal of time doing politicking and campaigning and doing his level best to bring it down. Or in the case of UK Parliament, reshape it more in his own image. This is all about the 28 election and making himself Prime Minister. That's what all this is about. And we should take him seriously. And the Tory party doesn't really have a counter to that. And I'm not sure the way it's going that Labour does either. So, we perhaps do need to take this seriously.
Okay, come in now, please, Linda, with your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I detest Farage. I detest his party. I detest those who adhere to the values of his party deliberately, because there are people who are totally taken in by it and don't recognise what's at the core of it. So I detest all of that, and it angers me that it's managed to get a foothold. What angers me even more, though, is what I believe to be the assistance that the Conservative Party in particular have given to allow this to happen. By the way they have spoken, by their policies, by their populism in an effort to remain relevant, an effort to get re-elected, they have encouraged the likes of Farage and his followers. I'm also angry at the Labour Party. Not quite as much to blame as the Tories, but they have not done enough to refute the views of reform and to let people know the realities of situations. A very basic example, the difference between immigration, refugees and asylum seekers. I've yet to hear anybody in the Labour Party making that very clear. They lump everyone together in the same, I was going to say in the same boat. Oh my goodness, how relevant that is for so many sad, poor people. But they lump everyone together as if they're all illegal. There's no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker. And they allow everybody to think that the UK is being overwhelmed more than anywhere else in the world by all these immigrants, and it's just a pile of nonsense. So the UK mainstream parties, I will excuse the Liberal Democrats from that. Are they even mainstream? But they're not guilty of it. But the Tories and the Labour Party allow this rhetoric to go unchecked. So they are every bit as much to blame by the way that Farage has been able to get a foothold in the UK and its Parliament as reformer.
Yeah, you mentioned there the UK Parliament. You may have seen the remarks of Sir John Curtis in the past week, talking
Oh yeah,
about the
yeah.
possibility of reform in Scotland and disrupting either a unionist or a nationalist parliament. Do you think that's a credible threat in Scotland?
It is, because they got not too bad a turnout in the UK election in Scotland. Not too bad a support when you consider nobody knew any of the candidates or anything like that. In UK terms, for first past the post, it looks very small. But if you take that into proportional representation terms, and the Scottish Parliament has a form of proportional representation, which is the additional member system, it is feasible that you could end up with a Reform candidate getting elected in one of the regional lists. I hate the thought. I would find it very, very difficult. I remember I was on the British Irish Parliamentary Association during the last term that I worked in Parliament. And at a couple of these meetings, there were people from the Brexit Party came to talk and be part of it. And his name's escaped me just now, but no, it's come back to me. Neil Hamilton, remember him?
Oh God, who can forget? You
Yeah,
just edit him out
yeah.
of your mind.
Yeah. Well, he was Brexit Party, and so he came to a few of these meetings. And did he not turn up with that wife of his as well? God, what a joy. Anyway, I found it really difficult to even be in a room with them. And there was one meeting in particular where I was going to end up sitting next to him. And it really, because it was done alphabetically, and it really, really bothered me. As it was, he didn't turn up, so that was okay. I didn't have to do it. But I would find it very hard to work alongside in any spirit of cooperation with any of these people. And I think there'll be members of the Scottish Parliament who will feel exactly the same. So it's quite a worry.
Okay, well let's hope it doesn't happen. And after a fairly depressing morning of headlines, a cheerier piece, and an event took place to mark the 25th anniversary of the reconvening of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood yesterday. Christine Graham, MSP, said that the Parliament had transformed the lives of the people in Scotland, which I think few would disagree with, and we can look at free prescriptions, bus travel, baby boxes, the child payment, and so on. And she said we should all be proud of that, rightly so. But of course, it hasn't all been wonderful. There are deficiencies, and it seems that often unionist politicians point to the built-in deficiencies of the Parliament as a way to attack the SNP government in power, saying they should be doing this when it's perfectly clear because of financial restrictions they can't. So you were in the infant class for that, Linda. What are your reflections on 25 years of it, and what do you see as the way ahead?
Yeah. Just saying the infant class, I remember in 99, when we got elected, I was below the average age. And by the time I retired in 21, I was way above the average age. So it was like infant and going through adolescence and growing up. What I found particularly interesting over the years is for those of us of my age group, and for those of us younger, but not young like you guys, there was this new parliament, and we still talk about the new parliament, 25 years, that's still really new, it's in its infancy. Blah, blah, blah. And I recognised fairly early on, going to talk to school kids and university students and things like that there was very quickly a generation for whom there had always been a parliament sitting in Edinburgh. And it wasn't new at all. And so you had to change the format of some of the things that you were saying and explain to them. In fact, latterly, towards the end of my career, I had to start these talks by saying, do you know that for 200 years we didn't have a parliament, and it only came back to us in 1999? And you could see the amazement on their faces because it just hadn't entered their heads that the parliament wasn't always there. So I guess that's a good thing. That's a positive, because it means that there wasn't absolute despair about what the Parliament was doing, because if there was, these people would have known that, because there would be a call for it to be abolished or whatever. So I think that was a very positive thing. I think it's had its difficulties. And something you mentioned, Douglas, I think is very relevant. It's very easy to blame the Scottish Parliament for things they're not necessarily to blame for. And we haven't quite got to the point where there is complete honesty from all parties about who's responsible for what and what can be done in Scotland and what can't be done in Scotland. So I think that's a difficulty. I think that over the last wee while, there has been a deliberate attempt by unionist parties. I would say the Tories, the newer Tories, I talked earlier about how there was a bit of a step change in 2016 and it seems to have got worse. I think there's a deliberate attempt, policy, whatever, by that group and others to deliberately do down the institution. So it's not just about having a go at the government of the day, which is SNP, it's also about having a go at the institution. And I find that very worrying. I don't like that at all. And it's like if they can try to make the institution lesser, back to Tony Blair's parish council, not really a parliament, ha ha ha, it means they think the case for the union gets stronger. So I find that very, very sad. And I do know, I certainly will not name names, but I do know there are Conservative Party members who used to serve who feel very sad about that as well. Because they decided, even though the Tories campaigned not to have our Parliament, there was a decision taken when the democratic process went through that they would work to make it work. And they did under David McCletchie and then Annabel Goldie. And there's a bit of a sadness that has very much changed. There's a bit of a sadness in me that they're still in the Conservative Party, I have to say, but there you go. So I think that's something we have to fight against.
Thank you, Linda. Well, Linda has talked there, Francis, about confusion over devolved powers and reserve powers. So it's probably even harder viewing it from England. But we do have a good Scots tradition from Burns of wanting to see ourselves as others see us. So I'd be interested in what your view of the Parliament is.
I think actually a lot of people in England would regard the Scottish Parliament as pretty competent compared to some of the stuff we see from Westminster. So I know it's kind of all gone pear-shaped in recent months, and there are financial difficulties and so forth, and there's been all the hoo-ha over the SNP finances and the rest of it. But over the years, the general view has been a certain amount of envy across the board at this apparently competent government that's able to deliver things that apparently the Westminster government can't. So for what it's worth, I think you've done rather well.
Good. And I mean, obviously, if I ask you for what should the future be, Linda, it will be a parliament in an independent Scotland. But moving towards that, is there anything that can be done to strengthen the powers of the Scottish Parliament before that, or should it just be straight full steam ahead for independence?
Well, I think we've always, my view is you always argue for more powers. You don't refuse the thought of more powers. And, we have had, I think there's been 2 different Scotland Acts since the initial one that set up the Parliament that have given a degree of more powers. It's probably time for another one, although the UK is in such a mess. A lot of it by its own choosing, I have to say. I would like to see a joint thing. Yes, I would like to see more powers, but I would also like to see our Parliament being bolder. I think there are things that we could be doing, and I'll bring it back to the start of the conversation when we were talking about the non-dom tax thing, and Francis said that there are moral issues. I think we could be a bit bolder in the Scottish Parliament about some of these moral issues, and I would go back to taxation. I don't think we do everything we could. And I say this not as an economist, Francis. I say this from a basis of not an awful lot of detailed knowledge about these things. But having looked at it over the years and read some stuff. I'll go back to land taxation, for example. I think there's some of that we could be doing. I think we weren't bold enough when we looked at potential replacement of council tax. I was quite sad that we didn't push forward with that and just seemed to have abandoned it. So yes, we could be bolder, but yes, we could have more powers to allow us to be bolder. That may be in terms of borrowing powers, etc., for capital projects, etc. So I think it's two-pronged.
Yeah, it would be nice, Francis, to get an economist's view on the possibilities of taxation. And the other thing which is so baffling to many of us in Scotland is that we produce more renewable energy than we need to power every Scottish home, but energy being a reserved matter, we have no control over that economically, and we end up paying more for our electricity than you do in the south of England.
Yeah, it's nonsensical, really. So that is an area that needs to be looked at. And as you say, greater control of taxation. And I agree about borrowing, actually, for capital projects. I don't think that the Scottish Government, or indeed any of the devolved governments at the moment, have sufficient power to borrow to fund much needed capital projects in their areas. So I would like to see more progress on that. Hopefully that discussion can be had, and I would suggest actually this is an area where the Scottish Government could usefully work with the other devolved administrations.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's the end of our agenda for this week, but I can't let the week pass without noting the death of Margaret Natalie Smith, known to everyone as Dame Maggie Smith, who to the younger generation will know her as Professor McGonagall in Harry Potter, or the Dowager Countess of Grantham in Downton Abbey. Now, not forgetting her Oscar-winning performances in California Suite, or appearances with Olivier and Sir Ian McKellen in Shakespearean films, or Zeffirelli's Tea with Mussolini, a whole generation will, particularly in Scotland, will remember her as Muriel Spark's conflicted protagonist in the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. So farewell, Dame Maggie Smith, who died in London at the age of 89. And before I say farewell, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We urgently need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We're at crisis point and really need your donations right now to be able to pay our bills and survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, first of all, to two very interesting guests today, to Linda Fabiani and to Francis Coppola. Goodbye to you both.
Bye.
And goodbye to you at home or wherever you are. And thank you for watching. And please join us on our evening news programmes at Scotland at 7 throughout the coming week. For me, goodbye and thank you.